So, hi everyone. So I'm Dan Lockton, and I'm going to present today on behalf of Dixon Lowe, who can't be here. And actually, the way he's done it is quite interesting. He's produced a video of his presentation, so I'll sit down in a minute, or maybe I won't sit down, but I'll stand here and occasionally interrupt to explain things, or to join some bits together. It is actually probably a better presentation than one could give in person, because I think he probably rehearsed it more and more and more to iterate it down. So it's quite an interesting approach. So what we're going to be talking about today is experiential augmentation, and what this is really about is about looking at how it's almost like a kind of an approach to bringing calm technology sort of thinking to augmented reality in some way. And so we'll get into it in a minute what that means. We're presenting, we're from Carnegie Mellon, but from the design school rather than HCI, which makes a slight difference perhaps to some of the way we've approached the work. So this is Dixon. This is, he says hello remotely. And so I run a thing called the Imaginaries Lab, which is a kind of new research group that looks at, I guess, kind of it's a set of graduate students and a dog and myself, looking at really questions of how we use design methods to help people, to understand how people understand things. So using them as a kind of way of probing people's mental models, mental imagery, folk theories, the imaginaries that people have of how they understand systems in the world. So not just technology, but also more broadly. But also how we might use design methods to help people understand in new ways. So there's a kind of, I'm sure a lot of work at CHI is kind of this in one way or another. We're also looking at like helping people imagine new ways of living as well, which gets more into kind of behavior change and influencing that. And the sorts of projects are things like, how do people understand local government, for example? If you treat local government as a system, how do you enable people to kind of explore their understanding of that? Or, if you could hear electricity, would you understand it differently? So we're doing quite a lot of work on energy sonification, for example, like as a new interface for energy use. There's also quite a lot of work on metaphors in different ways. So things like, could you use model landscapes to help you explore how you think about your own life, for example? So kind of externalizing the mental imagery you might have or the metaphors you might use. And doing it in groups as well to kind of arrive at group understandings. And so a lot of the work is getting towards metaphors in some form. And we've got a project we're just starting now called New Metaphors that's looking really at, can we generate new metaphors? Obviously we can. How do we do it? What do they mean? Are there ones that are useful for explaining certain big concepts, climate change or the economies of countries in different ways? And how does that get represented through interface design or through communication? And so this is also related to this area of more qualitative forms of interface design. Now, we had a late-breaking work thing last year at CHI about this, and it's a bit, it's very kind of very early days with this, but looking at forms of how the qualities of things in the world might be translated or maybe not actually translated, used more directly in interfaces. If we're looking at those, you look at the underneath of your umbrella, for example, this morning or last night, that is an interface for how heavy the rain is and what direction it is. So there's something there around using properties in the real world as a kind of as a way to explore all the qualities of those properties as a way to give us information on what's going on. So that's kind of what Dixon started to explore here. So for the first bit of the video, he's going to introduce what is experiential augmentation.
In recent years, augmented reality has begun to leave the research realm and gain a commercial following. It's appearing more and more in our smartphone apps, and companies are looking into consumer head-mounted options as well. But how should we design for this medium? Pop culture would suggest that we rely heavily on current 2D UI conventions, but that seems odd. Our current UI language was designed for screens. Why doesn't the design language change when designing for a screen versus for augmented digital content in the real world? On the computer screen, much of the information we receive is communicated using symbols and icons. But in the physical world, we process a lot more of what is called indexical information. Indexical visualizations are qualitative and rely on our understanding of cause and effect to communicate information. For example, the movement of tree leaves tells us how strong the wind is, and lights at night can tell us about population distribution and where the borders of cities are. Our research investigates whether designers can borrow this learned understanding of indexical signs and use them as building blocks for data visualization. An example, this pouch is sinking into the surface it sits on. We can see that it's heavy. And heaviness can tell us something about quantity. This pouch is probably filled with something. So the deformation on the surface becomes an indexical or qualitative sign that the pouch is full. Now, can we borrow this connection between heaviness and fullness in our visualizations? For example, can we sync a USB drive into the table to show how full of data it is? We call this experiential augmentation, the use of meaning gleaned from past understanding and experiences and applying it to the augmentation of objects. But why should we do this? If we wanted to show a USB drive is full through augmented reality, couldn't we have put a bar or a gauge onto the drive? We could have, but imagine a room filled with such devices all clamoring for attention. The vocabulary of a 2D UI interface was created with the assumption of the user's full attention. That's why it's dangerous to use your smartphone while crossing the street. Translating this UI vocabulary into augmented reality results in sensory overload, and that overload is depicted brilliantly in this critical design film, Hyperreality by Keiichi Matsuda. But since humans are already used to filtering in and out the qualitative vocabulary of the natural world, we propose that using this vocabulary to communicate the state of augmented objects is a step towards creating a calmer and less intrusive version of ubiquitous computing.
So what Dixon did, what we did, is studies where we actually simulated different kinds of augmentations, very subtle, quite gentle kinds of approaches, and we mocked them up rather than actually doing it in augmented reality. We mock them up, essentially presenting them as images or short video clips to people, not via a headset. And I can talk a bit more about that later, if you know, because it's a question that probably will arise. But the reason partly was to reduce the number of other variables that you were dealing with. This is almost like you're looking at this thing, and as you'll see, you're looking at these mock-ups, and we're trying to get the sense of what is people's reaction to it immediately, rather than in the context of wearing a headset and exploring other things in that environment. So we basically presented people with mocked-up augmentations of particular things, and then explored via a survey what people think they meant. So on your first reaction of these things, what do you think it means? What is it implying to you, given that you haven't got any other information about it?
Experiential augmentation uses our understanding of physical phenomena as building blocks for data visualization in objects. To understand how people would interpret these visualizations, we created a series of images and videos depicting objects with altered physical qualities, and asked people through an open-ended survey what they thought it meant. We depicted objects floating, gaining weight, losing rigidity, opacity, and color, as well as 2 variations of altering the sound that an object makes. Each study was also done with a series of objects to understand how the identity of the object itself influenced meaning interpretations. For example, in our first series, Float, we had a series of objects floating. We then wanted to know 2 things: whether we executed our visualizations clearly, and whether the visualizations communicated a clear meaning. To test execution, we asked, what's happening to this object? Then to test meaning, we said, you may have noticed that in each image one object is floating. Why do you think it's doing this? You'll notice that in all studies we tried to use a simple object like a block of wood as one of the examples. We originally thought that since wood did not have any underlying process or hidden information to depict, it would make a good control case. When analyzing our results, we quickly found that this was a mistaken assumption, as participants were able to glean meaning from all our object visualization combinations. In the float case, we found that floating had an emotionally positive and active connotation. Regardless of the type of object, including wood, participants responded that the object wanted to be picked up, or was making itself available to be used. The meanings interpreted in the float series all relate to a simple "look at me" type notification. In contrast, in the SIGCHI series of studies, interpretations were linked more closely to the identity of the object, their functionality, and their material. Participants suggested that a sinking debit card, for example, suggested that they were in debt and shouldn't spend money, and that a sinking USB drive was heavy with data and should not be used. The rigidity loss series showed that we can connect meaning to people through an object. Some participants interpreted rigidity loss in a business card to signify that the owner is untrustworthy or even dead. Others thought that the owner had moved on to new types of work and the card was outdated. As for the debit card, participants thought it was intentionally lowering its usability to stop the owner from swiping it to spend money. In our series on opacity, we again saw that wood doesn't necessarily have no underlying meaning or process to visualize. Participants thought it meant that the wood was rotting or in bad quality and shouldn't be used as building material. The smartphone fading was connected to fading battery power, although there were other interpretations as well, such as the phone being disabled or in do not disturb mode. And the debit card fading was seen as a warning not to use the card. Next, we have the color loss series, which highlights the importance of the fine line between reality and augmentation. Participants had trouble understanding what the discount card and wood losing color meant, because in reality, you can have wood painted gray, or you can have a black and white discount card, whereas the black and white apple was almost unanimously interpreted as rotten. Finally, we created a series of sound studies, the first of which we added sound to the shaking of objects that don't usually make a sound. In this, participants were able to link sound to quantity, with heavier or louder shaking relating to more data in the USB drive. The second series added the sound of flowing water to objects. This series was a failure, but one that yielded interesting lessons. Participants responded that they knew what we were trying to do, for example, to link the sound of water to the transfer of data, but the juxtaposition of water and electronics made them uncomfortable. Our metaphor created a conflict with the participants' understanding of the object.
So what we then did from this is we tried to work out, well, how do we analyze this? So we had a lot of insights from people, saying I think it meant this, or they were confused about what that meant, or maybe it means this thing, maybe it means something else. So we tried to develop a model for analyzing this that used concepts from semiotics, but also concepts from the study of metaphors in linguistics and elsewhere in interaction design. And then try to get towards some kind of tentative design recommendations for this sort of thing, given that it's not terribly difficult in augmented reality to add fake shadows to things, right? Which is essentially what a lot of this is. It's either graying something out or reducing the opacity or changing the color or changing the saturation or adding shadows in particular places. So if you were designing with this in mind, what are the kind of recommendations for how you might go about doing it? And I think as we'll see, they're not particularly strong recommendations, but there are certain themes that emerged. And they can be the basis of some future work where we explore this in slightly more detail.
In the last video, we talked about both the successes and failures of our experiential augmentation studies. Analyzing these results, it became clear that each participant's interpretation of our visualizations could be broken down into 3 building blocks. We have the participant's subjective understanding of the object, the participant's understanding of the augmentation, and the type of meaning delivered by the object-augmentation combination. First, on understanding of the object. Many of our visualizations convey extra information about technology like USB drives or debit cards. We originally thought that simpler objects like a block of wood or a blank piece of paper could be used as a control. On the other hand, fading out an electronic device like a phone did not link to materiality, but power, leading to interpretations that the phone was running out of batteries. Even though the same phenomena of fading was applied, the participants' understanding of wood versus phone altered the meaning that fading conveyed. Being able to understand what's happening with the augmentation or visualization itself is the second building block. We found that people drew on their past experiences and even pop culture to interpret what was happening. An example of pop culture interpretation occurred in the fading studies, where one participant was reminded of the movie Back to the Future, saying that objects fade because something in their past has been altered. Finally, we have the type of meaning. We found that visualization object combinations can be interpreted through different lenses, and we categorize these lenses into 4 overall types. Personification is where the participant thinks about the object as a living thing. For example, the USB drive is sinking into the table to hide from me. It doesn't want me to use it. A metaphor is where invisible processes in the object are likened to more concrete objects. For example, The USB drive is sinking because the data inside is so heavy, which demonstrates the metaphor of data as a physical thing, with weight. The physical affordance category was for responses that viewed the augmentation as a signifier on how to physically use the object. For example, the USB drive is stuck in the table. It's hard to pick up, meaning I shouldn't use it. Finally, the category of notification was for interpretations that thought the augmentation was simply calling attention to the object, but without any deeper meaning. For example, the USB drive is syncing to notify me of something, but that something is unclear. The three building blocks of understanding of object, visualization, and type of meaning combine to form a model that helps us understand how participants glean meaning from our visualizations. Here's an example application. Those that see the USB drive as a container of data were able to connect the visualization of syncing to a metaphor of a heavy physical object, interpreting the meaning as the drive is heavy with the data that it contains. Whereas those that saw the visualization as a hole in the table and interpreted through the lens of affordance thought the drive is stuck in the table and difficult to pick up. In both cases, the visualization causes the participant to prefer using the normal drive over the augmented one, but their reasoning is different. This understanding is important if a visualization needs to be tweaked to change a specific participant's interpretation. Finally, we'd like to give a series of design recommendations or principles for those interested in experiential augmentation. The first is craftsmanship. Is this USB drive sinking into the table? Or does there just happen to be a hole in the table where the drive is sitting? Probably more the latter. To make the drive look like it's deforming the table, the deformation needs to be more flush with the drive itself. Since we're altering real-world properties to make visualizations, the execution bar is higher than in traditional 2D UI. The next principle is to make the augmentation a bit weird. Anything that can happen in the real world may not be identified as an augmentation in the first place. Also make sure that augmentations do not conflict with the schemas of an object. Don't do what we did and try to augment electronics with the sound of water, because knowing that water breaks electronics distracted people from finding meaning in our augmentation. Where appropriate, try to use augmentations that have a slightly negative meaning. Sinking has a negative connotation, whereas floating has a positive one. We found that positively connotated visualizations were often interpreted with a general "look at me" type meaning, and people would stop digging deeper. Whereas negatively connotated visualizations drove people to ask why and come up with meanings that were more closely related to the identity and the function of the object. Finally, here are some considerations as we look towards future work. We understand that our framework is able to analyze how participants have interpreted a visualization, but not quite predict how they will interpret something that they haven't seen. This is what we want to tackle next. We also intentionally did not put our objects in a specific context, as well as de-emphasize the device which these augmentations might be delivered, because the context and the device are all part of a network of objects which would complicate our model. Now that we know how our model behaves with one object, we can start experimenting with more.
So that's it really. The last bit there is the kind of summary of how of kind of what the point we're at, I guess, with doing things in future and what it's leading towards. But yeah, I mean, I'd welcome questions and comments from people who have more experience with perception visualization in different forms, and ideas for how we might take this further in different directions. But also Dixon would love to hear your comments. So his email address is there. I mean, I'll relay them to him, but he would love your comments and feedback. So thank you.
Hi. Now, I don't know if I'm qualified to ask a question, because you want a question from people who are experts. Anyway, really interesting work, thanks. Really inspiring. I have two questions. One, for context, could you say a little bit more about how the studies were run? Because some of the comments that you collected seem to, I don't know, give me the impression that maybe are these design students, and how would it change, you think, if you did this on Mechanical Turk or something like that? And the second question is, I get the impression that some of these principles could be translated to screen-based media or even sort of like Internet of Things objects. Could you say a little bit about why you decided to focus instead on this sort of virtual reality and whether you think that they could translate or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the first question, yeah, they were a mixture of students. I mean, they were student participants mostly. They were mostly graduate students. It's about 30 in total. They were, I've got the details in the paper of exactly the breakdown, but they were mostly international. So the cultural bias perhaps meant that things like the Back to the Future fading photo thing, there were only, there was one person who noted that, for example. So it wasn't a big study, but it was more, and they weren't all design students or HCI students, but they had a mixture of backgrounds. But on the other hand, they were all students studying at a more advanced level, so perhaps they were aware of concepts like, some of the concepts maybe already in some sense. Yeah, it will be really interesting to see how it would apply in bigger, in a Mechanical Turk sense or with bigger audiences, different kinds of audiences. Yeah, that's definitely a limitation of it. In terms of why we did it with or tried to, I mean, in a sense, we didn't actually do it with augmented reality. We did it with pictures of things, or some of them printed, some on screen. So actually, in fact, I think they're all on screen. In fact, in the way that the study was done. So in a sense, they are screen-based things already.
But I was thinking more in terms of, like, say, if you're designing a website, could you apply some of this principle if you are designing? Because you said, I think, very clearly that it was screen-based out of practicality, but you were imagining it as a sort of virtual or augmented reality. So I was wondering, if you had any thoughts about, like, would you advise someone to sort of try to take these lessons and translate them to the design of a, say, Internet of Things device or like a website?
I think it'd be really interesting to do that, yeah. And I can see there's potential in terms of certainly things with, like, if it's possible to change the appearance of a device or the way that it appears in some way, then yeah, I think some of this relates to that. I think it's difficult to change shadows in real life without a light source, which you could do. I mean, that could be a whole other area of things, like devices that intentionally change the way they present themselves, in the physical sense. But I mean, I guess it's easier to augment it in a, if someone's wearing a headset and they look at something and its appearance is altered, that's probably more practically easy to do. But yeah, I think that hopefully there are implications more widely as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Ilya from iWay. I wanted to ask, first of all, it's a fascinating research. I wanted to ask if you experimented with metaphors that are not from the real world, not reality-based, but from literature and culture, like magic and stuff like that.
Nice. We didn't in this study, but I think we should do. And I think there's a lot of potential there for things that enable completely different approaches to this, because there's no real reason why, I mean, augmented reality doesn't just have to replicate reality. I mean, the whole point is adding stuff. So yeah, there's definitely things that we could experiment along those lines. We haven't done it with this, but we could do in the future. Thank you.